Thank you very much. What I want to do in summarising this debate are two things. I first want to ask, who makes better decisions? We're going to tell you that we think the domestic populaces in these post-intervention states will often make irrational decisions based on imprecise information. Second, the consequences of leaving early. We're going to look at the arguments which our first opposition team gave us, and we're going to look in particular at the issue of power vacuums, which we don't think were adequately responded to by the previous speaker. So first, who makes better decisions? We think there are several reasons we think the average Iraqi or the average Rwandan may not make a good decision post an intervention. What are they? First, as first opposition rightly point out, they often don't have adequate information. The last speaker just stood up and told us, well, they have an incentive, a greater incentive than, say, the US public to get that information. We don't think the point is whether they have an incentive, it's whether they can get that information or whether they believe they have the information. For instance, when you're being told by your tribal leader that you are fully informed, even if you're not, you're often prone to believing that. It's not about incentives, it's about the method of communication and who actually gives you that information. You don't have access to things like a newspaper, you often don't have access to things like the media to give you more information than you have in those situations. Second, on the nature of what people respond to. What Jack tells you is there are events of totemic significance which may not represent the overall actions within a particular country. There may be one act during a war or an intervention of collateral damage, but particular political leaders in your country decide to make that a major issue. They decide to say, look at all those harms by pointing to that one event. We think that's massively problematic because there's an asymmetry in this situation. Because while it's very easy for people to point to that, it's much harder to point to all the gains which could be made in the future because of occupation. That's why we think in terms of the messages then, there's a huge difference. And that's why we don't think individuals make good decisions on that side. Third, we think lots of individuals, like for instance the Serbs, will never want you to leave. We hear a response which is a necessary but not sufficient condition. But this is precisely the problem. Look for what happens, for instance, if the Serbs, through elections year after year in Kosovo, say, we don't want you to leave, and then you do leave. That's when you have a huge support for the country. It's very easy to say, the West has abandoned us, even though we didn't want them to do so. The West might have had a stated policy objective, but they still did not do it. That's what causes hatred in those particular circumstances. The next question we ask is, how are the United States? Can they make good decisions? First, they talk about the fallacy. Who makes decisions on military strategy? Who makes decisions? They claim it's the US public. We think it's almost always military advisors of the US government or the US executive itself. Look at where decisions about Iraq were made, not by referenda, but instead by people in the Bush administration and then the Obama administration, irrespective of people brought in that situation. The next point on that one is we think that we want to talk about the cultural specificity. This was a major point which comes out of first proposition on this. They say the Iraqis have a better idea of the political institutions they want, and the metric we use for success are wrong. Here's our point on this. First, they already concede that not all rights, not all institutions are necessarily culturally determined when they impose democracy on these countries. But second on that, when it comes to things like women's rights, when it comes to the kinds of rights we might want to put on, they can't adequately work out whether they want them or not, because they have pre-existing categories in their mind. They pre-existingly think that, for instance, the abuse of women might well be natural. They don't know the comparative in those situations. We think in many cases we do, or at the very least, we think there's a wash in this situation, because both apply. Know that. Let's look at the consequences of leaving. First point on this. Long-term intervention can be successful. I give you two examples. Look at Japan, look at Germany after World War II. We think over time you can definitely have successes. What in that mind, whether it's the proposition, are the negative consequences. The first consequence they say of this policy is they say, well, you end oil wars. I think Jack responds to this very, very thoroughly by saying most oil wars aren't humanitarian interventions. But if you presume the US is evil, all they do is delay the holding of elections exactly as they did in Japan until McCarthy sent that situation that you shouldn't. The second point of this is we do think you have a reprisal in circumstances of genocide, where lots of the harms caused 10 years ago re-emerge over time, as first opposition rightly tell you. We hear a response to that in Neil's speech where he says, why is it wrong for you to necessarily consent to a small probability of genocide? Why can't the Serbs, if presuming they aren't so risk averse that they decide to, why can't they consent to that risk of humanitarian crisis on themselves? It's because it's not each and every Serb consenting. It will be a majority at the very most of Serbs. We don't think any individual Serbs, or particularly a majority of Serbs in Kosovo, has the right to put that risk upon everyone else in this situation. There are massive power vacuums caused in these situations. Look at the example of Haiti. In 1994, we intervened. However, we don't install a strong government of Aristide. Years later, because of the factions involved, that collapses. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Ben.
The United States left Somalia because of one event that CNN viewers saw on its TVs. Why did they have better information than the people of Somalia who lived those lives and therefore knew exactly how secure they were?
Okay. There's a couple points on that. First, we think at best it's a comparative. I don't need to defend the way the US public or US administration works in each and every circumstance. We think it is comparative within those circumstances. But we think it's entirely plausible that the Somali public might well have wanted those troops out. We don't necessarily see it in those situations. Let's talk a bit more about the power vacuum. We tell you that what happens to Hamid Karzai, what happens to Aristide when you no longer have US troops to prop up your regime, to help you restore order? You turn to the only forces that are remaining that may be powerful warlords, that may also be the evil military which perpetuated former atrocities. I mean, that's particularly problematic. The final thing we would say in this is we don't think you'd go back in. Jack tells you a few reasons why. He talks about the opposition within a democracy. We're able to now say, why would you go back in when last time you went in, all that happened is you had to return to the old situation? We think that's massively problematic and a very strong rhetoric. They have two responses. They say, how about over-the-horizon agreements? Well, first, on an international law basis, we think countries might well ignore it, just like the US government was happy to ignore international law when it came to Iraq. In terms of the election binding case, this creates an expectation on electorates. We don't think electorates and Western publics will really care about one document you sign, but they might think their troops are going to die in those situations for no return, because history in those situations has said there is no return.